Today, we are joined by Dr. Christine Gibson, a skilled trauma therapist and author of the Modern Trauma Toolkit. From cognitive techniques to mindfulness practices and somatic therapies, Dr. Gibson's toolkit provides a comprehensive guide for navigating the challenges of trauma recovery. She is a family physician in Calgary, Canada, with a background in justice work, medical education, and global health. So quite a background. We're really excited to get into it. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. I was just explaining I was rushing from the medical school doing some of those other aspects of my work.
Yeah, it's you have quite the resume when you look. It's very impressive.
Yeah, when I was preparing for it, I was I yeah, like I actually ended up running everything I have on you through Claude 3, and it made like practically a novel for your bio. Like at the very
Oh my God,
bottom
that's
of,
hilarious.
yeah, it's like oh my goodness. And then we tried to shorten that into an intro, and then Rita just wrote it from scratch. So
There's also an actress named Christine Gibson, so maybe they threw some of her stuff in there too. I did not do any acting.
oh no, that wasn't any acting. We I didn't just ask it randomly. I take information that I go and research from you and plug it into it. So after I did probably 2 hours of plugging into it, and then it was just like huge. I was just like, wow. And then I read it like 5 times so I could be more familiar and stuff. And it's crazy. But yeah, good career. It's very, very good. All right. Um, well, first of all, I guess one of the first questions I wanted to ask you was, how did you get into everything that you do? I mean, because it's just there's so much there. Like, what caused you to do this?
It's really funny that you should ask that specifically today, Jason, because I just finished a doctorate in something called autoethnography, which basically means you're trying to figure yourself out. So ethnography is like looking through cultures, and auto is self. So I just did an autoethnographical doctorate trying to figure out, well, what is it that drives me? What is the thing that I do that's unique? And what could I do in the second half of my career to make an impact? So, the answers to that question are so many. Like we can talk about childhood and ancestral trauma. We can talk
Oh,
about my very strong connection to health equity, which I think relates to being Ukrainian and Scottish and just having that awareness of scarcity. Um, Trauma in particular has to do with being caught in the earthquake in Nepal in 2015. So there's been a lot of inflection points that have kind of said, hey, you should go down this path, that have taken me down different roads. So yeah, my CV is like really weirdly long because I've actually had a lot of different careers in such a short amount of time.
I,
wow.
so I work by day, in addition to this work, I am in like medical writing, journalism, and so forth. And I've interviewed like hundreds of clinicians. And what was so fascinating to me about your career is a lot of people do not talk about the health equity pieces and the ways in which uh, trauma is really like perpetuated and so hard to get out of, because if you can't change all these systemic issues, then people are just re-exposed to it over and over and over again. And so much of the mainstream discussions in psychology, psychiatry is like either you're broken, take these meds, or you've got to do more self-care. Like it's especially in like the US, it's very like you. There's something wrong with you, and I'm always saying, and I'm not even I have no degrees. I just talk to a lot of clinicians, and I'm like, but have you seen society? So I'm really interested in listening to your takes on that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that differentiates those of us who do work in health equity, and this group at the medical school, we were all a panel of docs doing equity work. And I think we're more systems thinkers. So we're not just looking at the one person in front of us who has a problem. we're looking at, well, what are the structures around them? Like the environmental structures, the political structures, the financial issues, like all of these things that are causing the problem. So we don't believe that problems just arise out of nowhere. And that's ultimately why I started doing more trauma work, is because the more that I investigated downstream effects, or what was the root cause of a lot of what we see in medicine, it turned out to be trauma. So, as in Canada, physicians are free, but a lot of the really good mental health clinicians, they're not free. So I thought, I guess I better train as a trauma therapist because I'm a free resource for patients in need. Um, but a lot of it is trying to move downstream and try to figure out, well, what is the thing that's causing all these problems? And inequity is a big one, trauma is a big one. And I think for those of us looking at systems, these are obvious intervention points.
Um, so I know, but could you explain what, for people that don't know, what health equity is?
Yeah, I mean, when I first started out in this like 20 years ago, we used to call it global health. And the whole idea
Okay.
was there's other people who are suffering somewhere and they're probably in Africa and we should go save them.
Hmm.
That has changed dramatically in 20 years, where we now recognize basically anywhere where there is inequity, where people have high resources versus low resources. Some of those resources can be financial, but sometimes it's like health literacy. Do you understand what your doctor's telling you? Do you have access to like healthy nutrition?
Mm-hmm.
Are you working 3 jobs, or can you actually get a good night's sleep? And it
Mm-hmm.
breaks down to really those basics. People live in something we call food deserts, and
Yeah.
they can access fast food, but they can't access vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
All of that impacts health so dramatically. So poverty definitely is a part of it. And the fact that the billionaires are making more money now is a
Mm-hmm.
huge problem for all of us. But there's some people who are affected first.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what health equity is the people who are impacted the most.
Yeah. It was like women. My my wife at the time, when she had a child, it was very difficult procedure and labor, and she wanted to get meds afterwards. And of course, they were like, here's some Advil, like, and ibuprofen, and whereas when I went to get a vasectomy reversal, they gave me something like 30 Vicodin so I could take one before I went in. And I was just like, I didn't even actually, I never even went and got it filled because I didn't know why I even needed it. But turns out I did, but I didn't. But anyway, but yeah, and I was just like, and so we were just talking one time, like, how do you not have like all these meds? And it's like if men gave birth, I think that it would be different. I really do.
You totally nailed it. And that's a really good perspective on equity too. There's one word that I really love that I learned about after medical school was something called intersectionality. And this was coined by a lawyer named Kimberly Crenshaw when she noticed that if you're Black, you get treated differently by the court system. And if you're a woman, that's also true. But if you're a Black woman, it compounds
Yeah.
additives. Intersectionality recognizes all of the different social positions we have that might create inequity or give us privilege. And so we're sometimes loath to admit that we have privilege, but it's important for us to recognize the ones that we have
Hmm.
and to try to figure out how can we leverage our privilege to benefit the ones who are still dealing with inequity. And you would think that in modern times, with all of the vast resources that we have, that this would be improving, but it's actually getting worse.
Yeah. Yeah, in many, many ways, it feels like we've gone back like 100 years. Like we've just regressed so much in terms of this progress.
Yeah. Why is that? Like, is it a cycle,
I
do you
wish I
think?
knew that. Like I feel like all of us could just brainstorm. I worry that because women can vote and Black lives do matter, and there's some people that are so scared that other people have equality that they think it's going to take away their power, and not
Mm,
recognizing that there's power with instead of power over,
Mm-hmm.
and they really liked power over and they want to keep it going. Um, I don't know, but it's really terrifying to see, especially women's health rights, just regress so quickly. And we're at risk here in Canada too. I never thought I'd see that. But it's a
Wow.
possibility here.
Ah,
Oh,
wow.
can you talk more about that?
Yeah.
What's going on? Just
Try to be
briefly.
a little careful, but I live in Alberta, and so our premier has said things like, "We want to be the Ron DeSantis of Canada, and we want a pipeline to exactly what they're doing in Florida." And so she's
What?
creating all kinds of yes,
Who would
and so
say
she
that?
won, you know, right?
Oh my God.
Um, she's been based on that platform. And so there's this faction of people who are advocates for right wing, like really right wing, heavily Christian rhetoric, and they have her ear. So they're called Take Back Alberta, really similar kind of
Yeah.
way that they talk,
Make
the stuff going
Alberta
on in the
great
States.
again.
Exactly. It's the exact same sentiment. And so
Ridiculous.
they've already attacked LGBTQ
Oh.
education. They're going to go after women's health for sure. There's all kinds of pockets where, as healthcare practitioners, we're already really worried. They've already kind of said, well, if you're in addiction medicine, which is one of the places where I work, you can prescribe this, but you can't prescribe this. And, as doctors, we're not really used to being told there's the thing you can no longer do. And so
Mm,
the fact that they're already starting to intervene, they're really wanting a recovery-based model instead of harm reduction, which isn't evidence-based, and it's basically an attack on folks who are using substance use to help with their trauma.
hmm
Um, it's really kicking people when they're down, and it's so disheartening.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's most chilling to hear that this kind of right wing, that these sentiments are globally now taking hold instead of just like one area at a time during a period. It seems like it's happening all over simultaneously, and that is very scary. Um, yeah, and since you mentioned trauma and substance use, do you mind kind of digging into what the evidence does say in terms of like harm reduction and just talking about why people might use the substances, and in some cases do you feel like it is helping, in some way?
I love the way you phrase that. One of the things I say on TikTok, I'm TikTok trauma doc there, and I've been growing a channel for a couple of years because so many people want mental health education. And one of my catchphrases is that substance use is a solution to a problem that you have until you have better solutions. So I really take the shame out of folks who have addictions because I mean, I have a really socially acceptable addiction. I'm really into overworking. So that's one of the ways that I dissociate is I just like work from 9 till 9. Um,
Same.
so we all have the ability to dissociate. So many of us like doom scroll social media. The number of women that I see in their 40s who are drinking a bottle of wine or more every day, it's rampantly increasing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how we're trying to figure out how to cope with life. And then there's some people who take fentanyl. So
Mm-hmm.
none of us are all that different. So many of us are choosing these like addictive strategies to cope. And one of the things I loved about learning how to be a trauma therapist is during the dozens of certifications and studies that I did, I got to learn about it myself because I was on the struggle bus too. I mean, I think it's a journey to try to figure all this stuff out, but at least I have more tools now.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you mention all that and we think about like just the 40-year-old woman try like drinking a bottle of wine at night, like a lot of it is um how do you cope when things you can't change things, like, right, like you can't like if you can't change that you're working three jobs, or you can't, like, there are certain life circumstances that people just, it's not your fault and you can't necessarily get out of it. And so it almost, to me, feels like a privilege to even try to unpack trauma and treat yourself or heal in some way. And so how do you how do we deal with that? I guess.
Mm,
A really brilliant perspective, and it's literally the reason why me as a like a systems thinker was like, I'm going to join TikTok because
mm,
there's so many people there and it's free, so I can share, I can learn, I can hear stories of people with very different life experiences than me. People think TikTok is a bunch of dances, and it's not. There's
mm,
so many amazing mental health educators on there, so many social advocates. So I learn about a lot of things on TikTok. Frankly, I think that's why some of the politicians are scared of it.
mm,
So I jumped on there to say, well, how can I contribute to that ecosystem? And one of the reasons I wrote the Modern Trauma Toolkit was my patients were constantly saying, well, what's a good resource for me to learn about stress and trauma? And I didn't have a really great resource to give them that wouldn't be triggering or maybe too academic, like just written in a really heavy way. So I wrote this at what I was hoping was like a grade 8 level of education. Anyone could understand it. And my goal is to get tools into people's hands, not just like one individual trying to sort out their own nervous system function, which is important and amazing when you can do that. But also, how can we collectively figure out these systemic issues? So, what is it within like racism and sexism and ageism and medical trauma, ableism, all of these things that really need to be solved, and we can only do that together. So I tried to explore some of those like system level solutions too, and what kinds of policies create trauma. A lot of the stuff we've talked about already. So something like harm reduction means I'm going to meet you where you're at. So you are actively using, unless like you can't actually have a conversation, I'm still going to show up and I'm going to meet with you and we're going to do the best we can with the situation we're in. And the more that we have dealt with these big things like pandemic, climate emergency, the more that we're just like, wow, we just have to be where we're at because this is never going to look perfect.
Do you think that do you think people on the right actually want to save and help people that they say ridicule? Because I don't think all of them want, my opinion is I don't think they all want to admit it. That's why most of the arguments make absolutely no sense. Like I feel like some people I argue with, if they just said, "Look, I hate people that are not like me," we'd be done arguing. You know what I mean? But they always seem to say weird things like, "No, because of this, no, because of that." I'm like, but that doesn't make any sense. And I'm always trying to get them, just tell me you're a racist, and we won't argue anymore. I won't want to really talk to you, but just say it, or a bigot or whatever it is. Do you think that's right, or do you think that is there a way to talk to them?
It, it is such a complicated thing in my head right now, Jason, because like I do try to talk to people of all backgrounds, and I live in Alberta, so I'm bound to have patients who are ultra conservative,
Hmm.
and I have to find a way to like for us to find shared values and shared meaning.
Hmm.
For me to try to figure out what is their like goal when it's something that I don't necessarily understand and sometimes don't necessarily agree with, but still have to give them unconditional positive regard. So, one of the things that I've come to believe is that a lot of people who are fighting pandemic measures, who are trying really hard to stay racist, even though right now in modern times that's pretty unacceptable, they are fighting because their nervous system is actually stuck in fight and flight. So
Hmm.
they are actually really, really scared and they're generally operating out of fear. So I can
Hmm.
show more compassion to those kinds of responses when I think of it as fear-based instead of anger-based. Underneath anger, very often, is either hurt or fear. And they're usually not willing to talk about the ways that they feel vulnerable. I feel vulnerable to losing power. Like I'm an older white guy and I've always had all the power. I'm always the leader in any room. Don't you dare take that away from me. That
Hmm.
hurt might manifest as fight energy.
Yeah.
So when you have somebody at the grocery store who's like throwing a box of masks across the room, it's probably not the masks. It's probably something that's happening inside them. So even though I don't condone it and you have to be responsible for your own actions, I really do try to
Yeah.
figure out, well, what are the downstream causes? How could they have been hurt?
It's like their own
Um,
condition almost.
Yeah. And I don't want to pathologize everybody because like
Yeah.
trauma is not at the root of all things, but there's a lot of people who are stuck in fight and flight and it has nowhere to go. They have so much of that restless tension. They feel afraid, but they can't put their finger on why. It's
Mm.
so easy to blame immigration because that's something that's other and it's outside of you. It's really scary to examine what's inside you that could be causing these big feelings, but that's actually the work.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think in a lot of ways people have been taught, like, because a lot of things have been reinforced and you've been taught, and that the those that have the power have incentive to keep people divided in that way and to keep people blaming each other. So I think some of it is also that is like these things have been reinforced, and you know,
Well, and we won't look at them. So a lot of the people who are making these
Mhm.
arguments are the billionaires, and they're like, I'm not your problem, it's the immigrants. But
Yes.
dude, it's you. Like there should not be billionaires. So the people who are making these decisions on our behalf, they tend to be really wealthy people who are afraid to give up power. So they have to give us a scapegoat to be angry at. And that's what worsens inequity is because we start to buy into it and be like, oh yeah, it's totally okay that they are in trouble. They are going to be us soon enough because, there's a finite amount of resources.
Yeah. I read this study a while ago. It's from Harvard and UCLA, San Diego, and it's about the amygdala. Have you ever, does this ring any bells for you? Where they've found that conservatives have generally have an enlarged amygdala, which and the amygdala is now this is just me telling you that I read something. Everyone do your own research, but that the enlarged amygdala actually causes is a cause for fear and disgust and repulsion, which is disgust. Have you heard anything about that at all? Like, or is it something just
I
it's on
haven't heard of this study.
Psychology Today. So,
I can't wait to read it. That's really interesting. But it actually lends credence to my theory. So the amygdala is, think of it like your smoke alarm.
mhm,
So every message that comes into your brain is coming from either your outside environment or your inside environment. When it's inside, we call it interoception. And it's basically just like your body's telling your brain what's up, like, hey, I gotta pee, or aren't we hungry?
mhm,
And those are the inside messages. It tells us about pain, and emotions are made that way. So emotions are made when we have certain symptoms and our brain interprets those symptoms as an emotion. So those are all the inside messages. And then there's the outside messages. So when you've been through traumatic events, like anything that seems dangerous or threatening, your amygdala is really sensitive. So think of it like a smoke detector that like gets a whiff of perfume and is like beep beep, and it's really loud and it's really distracting. So when you have that loud and distracting system telling you you're in danger, it actually disconnects your thinking brain. So people whose amygdala is way overactive, they have trouble with forming memories, concentrating. And so when you were saying like they don't even make sense, I'm like, yeah, they don't make sense because their amygdala is so busy that their thinking brain is actually not working properly. So one of the reassuring things I tell my patients when I start working with them on trauma is I'll say, wouldn't it be nice if you had a memory and you could concentrate again and put things together the way you did before the event
yeah.
or in a way that you've never experienced before? Because after you heal your amygdala and your vagus nerve and all of these nervous systems that are responding to danger that isn't actually there, or sometimes it is, but it's like a perceived threat, um, your thinking brain comes back
Hmm.
online. So that's the amazing thing about our brain. And what I talk about in the modern trauma toolkit is the goal is post-traumatic growth and something called neuroplasticity, which is rewiring
Mm,
your brain. Things that feel dangerous wire your brain in one way, which makes your amygdalas big
mm,
and really overactive.
mm.
And we can wire it back again. Our brains are constantly changing. It's awesome.
Wow.
So thinking along that lines, how does somebody know? How would you recognize that? Oh no, things are not operating properly, maybe I need to rewire and like
Yeah. Because
you teach people how to recognize it.
the same people that you would tell, if you were to tell them, they would think you were insulting them because of the same issues. It'd be really hard.
Yeah. So how do you?
Well, and I mean, honestly, I think so many of us are. I think that's why so many of us are talking about trauma now,
Mm.
is more and more people recognize the level of toxic stress we've all been in. And, you know, groceries are more expensive. There's smoke in the air in this summer. There's all these outside signals that are saying, are you sure you're safe?
Mm.
Kids are struggling. Like I hear so many kids on TikTok, like, I'm not going to have children. The world is on fire. There's a lot of acknowledgement that toxic stress is affecting all of us. So the way that I try to explain it to people is there's two different pathways to respond to toxic stress in the body. So the first one is an active response. That's the fight and flight. So what it does, because we're just mammals, so the same as like a dog or a wolf, as a mammal, our brain tells us when you reach a challenge, your goal is to run away from it as fast as you can or to fight it. Well, that doesn't really work in modern times, but that's what ends up getting that fight energy stuck. So we might recognize it as people who are angry for no reason, irritable in public spaces in inappropriate ways, people who are restless and agitated. You know, a lot of young people, they're changing jobs every 3 months. They're like, I'm not satisfied here and I'm not satisfied here. That can be that flight energy. And then the other way that our body responds to stress is an overactive parasympathetic system, which is our resting system. And what that looks like when it's too much is it just shuts down. We call that freeze collapse. And these are the people who can't get out of bed. They can't get off their couch. They've got this list of things to do and they haven't even gotten started.
Mm.
And many doctors would just say, oh, you have depression. And to the people who are in restless state, they're like, oh, you have anxiety. I think this is one of the reasons why everyone's on meds right now. It's just so common. And some people need them. And for some people, it helps tremendously. But from my perspective, now that I understand more about trauma, I say, why don't we try to fix your nervous system and get you into your window of tolerance where you can self-regulate and you can get your nervous system out of overactive in either of those directions? And then let's see what symptoms you still have. And so my goal is just to get those skills into everyone's hands, because it turned out that this is a reasonably easy thing to do and there's no pill that does it.
I love hearing a clinician say that because I almost never hear that. And I know like pharma just has such a grip, especially in the US, that you're hard pressed to hear many people. But after all of the reporting and interviews that I've done, like I've come to believe what you said. I'm like, there are so many other solutions that people probably should be given first. But instead the go-to is just have this pill because if you can't live in this world, which is perfectly fine, everything's fine here. There's something wrong with you. Have this pill. And I'm like, wait a minute, this just does not sound right. And again, like I don't presume that I have any great knowledge on it because I don't have the degrees and and so forth to support it. So I love when people who have done that research and work say things like you just did, because yeah. And
But
so
honestly, I might have more credibility because of my degrees and all of the letters after my name, but I really do think that people like you who've interviewed a bunch of people and coming to their own conclusions, they're not satisfied with the current state of healthcare, this current state of psychology and psychiatry. Paradigms are changing because people are demanding it. They're saying, well, you gave me this SSRI and all it did was cause me sexual dysfunction. And it was really hard to come off. Like, why did you choose that route when therapy, from the evidence, works equally well, if not better? And to me, therapy gets at the root causes. Not everyone can afford therapy. Well, if you can't, what does it look like to heal in community? And so much of it, from what I now understand, we actually did from ancestral times. So our ancestors in almost every single culture had rituals and ceremonies to mark major transitions. We did things like chanting and circle dances. There is evidence base to show that chanting intervenes with vagus nerve regulation. So for a few reasons, you're out breath when you lengthen it. So when you exhale longer than you inhale, you're actually changing the balance between your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And when you vibrate your lungs by humming or singing or chanting, you're actually vibrating the sac, the pleura around your lungs, and that is right up against your vagus nerve. So what if all of our ancestors were onto something, because so many of them were religious or spiritual, or so many of them had these just community-based ways of being in the world that were already deeply healing. So one of the things I did in the Modern Trauma Toolkit is I tried to say, well, what do other cultures know about healing? And what does our innate mechanisms already know that we've been socially conditioned to forget? And it turns out a lot of the ancestors, they lie inside of us, and our ancestors knew it. Traditional Chinese medicine gave us tapping, which is one of my favorite forms of trauma therapy. It's self-acupressure. I love it. I'm obsessed. And it's evidence-based, which is super cool. We can tremor the same way. Like I have a dog companion. I heard one of you had a little barker in your room. He will shake his little body and totally recover from stress. Humans can do that. So I
Yes,
went and
mine
learned
does that
how to
too.
tremor.
I tell him to shake, like, and I can tell that that's what he's doing. It's a release. And I will tell him sometimes, if you see the fur stand up, I go, shake it off, Charlie, shake it off, and he does. And
Humans can do it too. And I
Yeah.
didn't know that. We don't learn this in medical school. And I would love if we taught this in schools.
Yeah.
So one of the things I just started this year was a company called Safer Spaces Training. And we're trying to get this knowledge into workplaces and professional bodies, like not just doctors and nurses and psychologists, but like realtors and lawyers and dentists and massage therapists and anybody who's having to deal with the public. The public is dysregulated, and we need these skills, all of us.
that's such a wonderful thing, because yeah, if you've ever worked in customer service or sales in any way, I mean, I years ago sold furniture, and it would become a therapy session, and you would watch like spouses completely melt down in front of you and go, I'm not equipped to deal with this. Why is this happening? So yeah, I mean, I think if we all just had those tools and people knew how to just speak to each other and understand and diffuse.
And
Yeah,
so much of it is figuring it out for yourself, because we have these little brain cells called mirror neurons where we can actually co-regulate, which means if somebody else is in their window of coping, it's a better opportunity for us to do the same. And it's one of the best skills that we learn as a therapist is, how do I regulate my own nervous system so that you have a better chance of regulating yours? Because if somebody's in front of you screaming and shouting, it's pretty hard not to get activated.
Yeah.
I've been terrible at that for most of my life, but I'm learning. So this is the kind of stuff that the more that we figure it out for ourselves, the more that our community benefits.
So what, for people watching, what might be like the human equivalent of the dog, like shake it off? Like, what is something that you recommend that somebody could do if they're having that like high stress moment?
So it's a practice called tension releasing exercises, or TRE. It was created by a social worker named David Rosselli, who's in the States, but he was working in war-torn environments. So he recognized, he was in a bunker, I think in Lebanon. The people who were tremoring naturally during the bombs, they didn't go on to have PTSD. So then he tried to figure out, because he was also a body worker, I think he did rolfing. He tried to figure out, well, if people tremor naturally when they're really stressed out, how can we elicit it? How can we help people learn how to tremor? And so it's not like you're deliberately shaking something. You're not kind of moving your hand or jittering your leg. the tremor that he teaches us how to do in TRE actually comes from inside. It's inside the psoas muscle, which is in the bowl inside the abdomen. And he teaches us how to exhaust the muscles around it so that the psoas muscle starts tremoring. And of all the people that I've taught how to tremor, I even have it on my TikTok channel. So there's a folder called Healing Skills. There's 3 different videos. Watch those videos. You can probably figure it out. There's a whole chapter in the Modern Trauma Toolkit, and then there's a QR code in the book where you can also get a 20-minute video. Literally anyone can tremor the same way your dog or your horse does and shake off stress. So I tell my folks who are really tense 2 or 3 times a week before you go to bed, shake off that tension. And just like you tell Charlie, your dog, or my dog Fife, they can shake it off. And I sound like Taylor Swift. But it is
I was
something that we're
thinking that, but I
totally
wasn't.
capable of.
Oh my God. So what's that look like? You say that, but now I have a visual, and is it just like, you know what I mean? Like, fix my visual. I'm not
So,
sure it's right.
the way that it generally looks for people is your psoas muscle tremors. And so that's the back body. So
Mhm.
most of us, we are way more involved in flexing and moving our front body because we are
Mm.
forward benders. We sit in forward positions. It's very rare for us to release the back body. So what he teaches us is to do lunges and a wall sit and all kinds of different exercise that exhaust our hip and our leg muscles. And that kind of involves our psoas because the psoas inserts itself on our thigh bones around the front.
Hmm.
But we can't really knead into it. We can't knead it with our thumbs. We can't push into it easily unless you're a really good massage therapist. So the way that we can release the psoas is by exhausting all of the surrounding muscles and then in 2 different positions, either within the wall sit or we lay down on a carpet or a yoga mat and we just bend our knees. And then the psoas muscle will kind of start wiggling our knees.
Mhm.
I've been tremoring for probably 4 or 5 years now. So when I do it, I don't have to do the exercises anymore. I just put myself into a yoga butterfly position and my body just starts tremoring because it knows how to do it.
Hmm.
And for me, I generally get like my shoulders will start shimming, like the whole back body will release for me now. I do it if I have insomnia, like if I can't shut my brain off and my body feels really tense and restless and I find myself flip-flopping like pancakes in my bed,
Mhm.
I'll get out of bed, do tremoring for like 5-7 minutes, pop back into bed and fall right asleep.
And you teach this on your TikTok?
I do it on TikTok. I have a chapter in the book
Okay.
with a accompanying video. Super easy thing to
Cool.
learn.
There's a link in the description,
Also,
just so
like
you know.
illustrations in the book. So with all of the body-based techniques, I wanted to make sure that I had illustrations, and then on the QR code, you can download those illustrations so you can have it on your phone.
Mhm.
What I want is for people to have these things at their fingertips. Like if you've learned how to tremor, but you're not totally sure how, you can pull up the illustrations and it's on your phone. If you want to do tapping for big emotions, like you tend to get anxious, you can pop into the bathroom and do a tapping sequence in a couple of minutes and go back into your board meeting and be regulated again. And I just want everyone to have
Right.
these things.
If there are any conservatives that have made it this far, they think we sound like so woke. And how do we not sound crazy to them so we can get them to try stuff like this? Because like I just feel like I'm like really intrigued and I'm thinking of my sister who's she would just be like, oh God, these people, they're so woke and blah 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 blah. Like, how do I get through to
Well, I
people?
think that's why I get to
'Cause
leverage, like for me, it's the credentials. Like I'm a doctor. I'm actually a double doctor now
double
because I
doctor.
have both the MD and then a D Prof. I have
Wow.
a master's and
Nice.
I have a bunch of other random letters. So one of the reasons why I've got so many credentials is because people tend to listen. Like I'm an
Good.
expert in lots of stuff. Even though I study somatic and ancestral practices, I
Mhm.
know as a Western trained physician, the evidence behind it, the physiology behind it, and I can say, you have a dysregulated nervous system. This is
Mhm.
an amazing, easy practice that you can do and you can teach your kids. Aren't you feeling super stressed out? Yeah,
Ah,
me too. We find those common values and common experiences because conservatives are super stressed out too.
yeah, oh yeah. I'm sending your link to a bunch of people just so you know. I'm gonna find the right
Awesome.
videos on your TikTok and send them. And with a very nice message. Not I'm gonna try to be.
Well, one of the ones that really blew up was cognitive.
Mhm.
So a lot of the skills that I love are body-based, but one of my super viral videos was something called affirmations. Have you guys heard of that?
I don't think so. Is it
What did
affirmations
you?
or affirmations?
Affirmations.
Oh no,
Oh,
I
I
have
have
not.
not. Yeah, I've written on affirmations. I haven't heard this one.
So affirmations are when you say things like, I deserve good things, amazing things happen to me, um, I am safe. Like all of those would be affirmations where you just make a
Mm.
statement that you want to be true. And sometimes you feel like it's true, and sometimes you're not quite so sure. But for a lot of us who've had trauma or toxic stress, when you say an affirmation, it actually sounds like you're gaslighting yourself. Like when you
Mm,
say, I am safe,
Mm.
and you don't really believe it, you're like, yeah, you're lying to yourself again,
mm,
honey.
Mm.
mm,
An affirmation is just taking an affirmation and tagging a what if in front of it. And sometimes you have to say, what if I can imagine a time in the future where I believe? And all you're doing is you're just tiptoeing towards an affirmation.
mm,
So one of my super viral videos on TikTok was just me saying, try affirmations. What if I deserve good things? What if I could imagine a time in the future where I feel safe? And all you're doing is planting seeds of possibility. So trauma responses kind of send us down one path. We go to fight and flight, we go to freeze collapse, we go to this like go to, and it's actually a reflex. We don't involve our thinking brain in that process. Affirmations let us choose new pathways. What if I could believe something different about my future?
mm,
What if I could believe something different about my ability to heal the past? Because so many of us are stuck in that reflex. And I think even with conservatives or liberals, all of us kind of get stuck in our ideologies, and the healing is flexibility. You know,
mm.
what does it look like to change our mind? What does it look like to try different ways of being? And the more that we're flexible, the more that we're not stuck in these trauma responses.
Mm. I won't talk about conservatives anymore. I'm exhausted with it now. I'm sorry. I'm always trying to get through to them. I'm doing it again. Go on.
You have a lot of people in your life that think differently from you, right?
Yeah, and it's frustrating. So I'm always trying to figure out a way. And lately I've been feeling really negative and just being like, you know what? Maybe it's just a fight. I want to fight. Maybe it's just fighting. And it's felt better, but I don't think it's the correct way to go.
Well, and again, I never say that there's a right way or a wrong way. I just say this is the best way you know right now. Like
Mm,
this is the solution to your problem.
mm,
And I often ask the question to my patients, why does it make sense that this is the way things have been, either in your thoughts or your behaviors? So it makes sense that you just like, okay, let's just fight because maybe they have a lot of fight and flight energy, and maybe that mirror
yeah.
neuron is activating. So
Mm,
why does it make
Mm.
sense that you just want to fight them? Okay, that takes the shame right out of it.
yeah.
And then what other responses are available? What's the flexibility that's available to you? For me, the first step is always compassion and self-compassion. So self-compassion is like, oh, yeah, it is frustrating to deal with people who don't think the same way I do. And then compassion for others is like, okay, why does it make sense that you've gone down this pathway? What is it you're afraid of? Because underneath anger is almost always fear or hurt. So,
Mm,
what hurts you? What are you afraid of? And sometimes that can be common ground because sometimes we're actually afraid of the same thing.
mm,
Mhm.
I guess.
Yes. So we haven't. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about, but like, and
Trauma.
we haven't, huh?
I mean, trauma.
Childhood trauma.
Ah, yes.
Because lately, the more that I've been discussing with people, just everyday people and clinicians and research, it seems like so many roads lead back to childhood trauma. And what I've been noticing now is there's a big amount of like awareness, I feel like, in like millennials and younger generations, and then kind of combating like their parent generation, particularly like the millennial versus boomer, and the ways in which like some of the things that have come to light, the traumas are like are shared. Like this was just the way boomer parents parented, and that was traumatic for millennials. And then other things, of course, are unique to like that family structure. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, what have you encountered there? Do you work with people with a lot of childhood trauma? And what's your perception of this kind of larger conversation that's been happening?
I mean, I'm super glad we're having the conversation. Of course, there's a backlash, and people are like, well, not everything is trauma. But to me, like, a lot of things are. And it's about time we had the conversation. So, underneath a lot of addiction is trauma. Um, Underneath a lot of fear and anxiety is trauma. And underneath a lot of like relationship issues is trauma. So, eh, and sometimes we can call it trauma, sometimes we call it stress. But I mean, trauma is when your body goes into overwhelm and goes into fight, flight, or freeze. But for a lot of, let's say, female identifying folks in society, we're taught to be people pleasers, and we were socially conditioned be smile all the time. Like the number of times me as a doctor who's like walked out of a really traumatic experience and into the next room and they're like, oh, smile, honey. I'm like, I'm gonna throw punch. Um, so we become fawners. So fawn is a behavioral response to trauma where we try to please everybody. And that's basically us being like, well, if I'm really nice to you, could you please not hurt me? Um, and it makes sense that we show up in that way, both because of social conditioning and also it might be protective. But so many of our behavioral responses are actually protective, but then we kind of shame the person for having it because we're like, well, what's wrong with you? A much better question to ask is what happened to you? Like, why does it make sense that this is your thought and behavior pattern? And then what else is available to you that still keeps you feeling safe? Um, that's the thing to understand. When I first started looking at trauma, so like after the earthquakes and just recognizing how many patients in my practice had it, eventually realizing that medical training is super traumatic and my first hospital-based job was horrifyingly traumatic. All of that helped me do deeper dives into the research. And it turned out that the big research paper proving all of this came out the same year I graduated medical school, so like 99. And it was called the ACEs study. So Adverse Childhood Experiences
Wow.
study conducted by an internist in California. He surveyed 10,000 people from middle-class families in the Kaiser Permanente network. And he just asked them 10 questions about different childhood experiences they might have had. He picked them kind of randomly, so he didn't actually cover everything. So it's not a great screening tool, but it turned out that it was way more prevalent than he would have imagined. And the weirder thing is, not only did more people have these experiences, but every single disease that he studied, whether it was diabetes, heart disease, asthma, physical conditions, mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, addiction, suicidality, or social conditions, poverty, early pregnancy, every single thing he studied had an exponential increase for every number of those 10 that he elicited. So if your ACE score is 6, it lowers your life expectancy by a certain number of years. If it's 10, way more. I'm working with the loveliest person who is very young and was diagnosed with cancer recently. And she said to me, well, that makes sense. My ACE score is 10. I knew I wasn't going to live long. And I'm like, oh God, no, honey, like this is public health. This wasn't about you. You and I were recovering. This was not your story. So even though that's a public health look at childhood trauma, it's not an individual story. And that's what I want to get out to people is like, even though your brain has changed because of what you've been through, you can change it again.
Yeah. And people's trauma, like one of the things I think I believe we need to figure out is how to accept other people's trauma as real, even if we don't think it would have been traumatizing to us. Because I think a lot of people will go, so your dad yelled at you? You know, like, yeah, it was my trauma. Thanks. And you had yours. And we should actually care about each other's trauma.
Well, and people are now actually willing to talk about the impacts, whereas the boomers were just told to stuff it.
Yeah.
Like now that I talk to my parents about childhood trauma, I mean, I can't go into details, obviously, but there was all kinds of trauma in the boomer generation, and they were just told to swallow it and suppress it. So that's the skill that they learned, and they learned to do it really well. And many people have learned to suppress it. It's super interesting because you can have a family of 3 kids who all were in that same environment, and one of them would have the symptoms of complex trauma and the other 2 might not. And then they're like, well, what's different with that kid? I mean, there's all kinds of possible explanations. There's also ancestral trauma that we inherit, and we're just starting to understand that. People always thought DNA was the brain of your cellular environment, but it turns out it's the cell wall because your DNA turns on and off and it methylates and it activates based on what it's exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the studies I quote in the Modern Trauma Toolkit is when they measured the saliva of babies when their mothers had been pregnant during 9/11 and somehow been involved in the New York area, the babies had really high levels of cortisol in their saliva who compared to normal controls. So they were born stressed because their mothers were stressed when they were in utero. The same thing is
Wow.
something that we find with ancestral trauma. So indigenous people, people who survived the Holocaust, we've actually studied their genes and there's methylated groups. We call this epigenetics. I mean, I studied undergrad genetics a few decades ago. This was not something we knew about. And so science has totally evolved to explain to us, well, why, when these indigenous people were put in residential school and, taken into the foster system and this attempted cultural genocide, why are they still suffering generations later? They actually inherited changed DNA.
So just to clarify, that means that external uh events that happen to you can alter your DNA, then pass it on to your children? Whoa.
Yes.
Wow.
So one of the reasons why you should do this work is to
Wow.
not fuck your kid.
Yeah.
He said I could swear.
You totally can swear. Yeah, wow. Oh my God. That's so nuts.
So what,
Yeah.
once you know all of that, and like if you have some of those backgrounds, what can you do to mitigate the trauma that does get passed down to other generations?
And that's the good news. The more that we've learned about how trauma affects us, we've been also learning just as quickly about how to heal it. So there's 2 different approaches. We've alluded to it, but one is cognitive or top down, and that's using your brain to affect the mind body system. The other is somatic or bottom up, and that's using the body to affect the mind body system. In my perspective, and lots of other like big trauma names like Peter Levine, Pat Ogden, Bessel van der Kolk, we believe that the body is the best doorway because, like we said earlier, when your amygdalas are really firing and that smoke detector is blaring and saying you're in danger, it's kind of hard to use your thinking brain. So I was told as a doctor, like CBT is the best thing to do. Cognitive behavior therapy works for everybody, for everything. Yeah,
It's
I
still in
don't
all of the
love it.
articles that I work on. That exactly what you're saying. It's like CBT.
Hmm.
And honestly, patients don't love it because CBT tells you there's something wrong with the way you think and it has to be fixed. Well, if your core wound from trauma is shame, and then your therapy tells you that there's something wrong with you and you need fixing, all you're doing is lumping more shame onto it. To me, I love lots of different other approaches that are evolving and emerging evidence is coming out. So body-based therapies like tapping, havening, tremoring, sensory motor psychotherapy, somatic experiencing. There's this huge long list. I would say EMDR or the eye movement treatment kind of straddles both thinking and body. My favorite trauma processing is called accelerated resolution therapy. Sometimes I can cure PTSD in a single session.
Hmm.
Like there are so many ways to approach this. My favorite cognitive therapy is called NARM, or the neuroaffective relational model. And that's where that question, why does it make sense, comes from. I just think it's such a beautiful way of approaching it because it doesn't add shame to the problem.
Can you now I
So
really want to dig it. Can I pause you for a minute? I want to hear how you
go
can
ahead.
cure
That,
PTSD in one
that
session.
was my
Like
question
both of
too.
us are like, please explain
Expedite
more.
what was it called?
It's called accelerated resolution therapy, and it's a cousin of EMDR. So EMDR is the eye movement desensitization training or therapy. It was randomly created by Francine Shapiro's eyes going from side to side walking through Central Park, and she recognized that it was resourcing her. She was feeling more regulated. So she created therapy around it. The thing about EMDR is it can take multiple sessions, and you kind of go through this schedule of events and chronological. Accelerated resolution therapy is more fun and playful. It's generally single session, 2 at the most, and you work on a theme. So instead of saying like, okay, let's start this kind of adolescent period, you just say you have this theme of abandonment. You have this theme of hurt. Watch a movie of all the times, like the lowlights where you've been the most hurt, probably the movie that's already playing in your brain all the time. And then we desensitize your body. So your amygdala stores the associations attached to traumatic memories and traumatic events. So things like, how did you feel at the time? Your emotions. What were your body sensations at the time? And what's the context of what was around you? And so your amygdala is triggered when those associations are triggered. So what we're doing is we're swiping the amygdala clean by creating new associations to the memory. So we're just attaching new emotions, new sensations, and new context to those same memories. The trauma's gone. It's
That's
amazing. It's like magic. I love it.
That's similar to what I have read and heard about like psychedelic therapy. So I went a few years ago, I went to a talk where they were discussing psychedelic therapies with psilocybin with it in relation to PTSD and saying that like with the use of that, it was like restoring the memory in a different way. Is
So
that
my chapter, yeah, my chapter on chemicals or drugs in the Modern Trauma Toolkit talks about antidepressants, anti-anxiety. It talks about herbs. It talks about psychedelics, because all of these are chemicals that we can put into our body that change our brain. And so some of them are written on a prescription pad, some of them are not.
Mm.
And psychedelics actually have the best evidence for trauma. So I'm a trained psychedelic guide. I don't actually work because capitalism. I'm not a huge fan of the current psychedelic environments that are legal. And I can't obviously do anything illegal because of my professional designations. So I jumped into learning to be a psychedelic journey guide because it just seems so promising that you could take something. One of the things that it does is it takes offline something called the default mode network, which is the way that we perceive ourselves. So when we think of us as human bodies, like this is me contained in my skin bag, what activates is the default mode network. That's our sense of self. And when we take psychedelics, it takes that offline. We lose our sense of self, which means we lose our ego, which means we get a greater sense of interconnectivity or connectedness to all things. We kind of dissolve into it. And then the things that have happened to us, we see it in such a bigger context. So we come out of that journey in a safe way. So what I want to say is a really important corollary is psychedelics only work in a safe set and setting. So set means mindset, which is you're going in, you feel safe with the person, you're actually regulated. That really matters. So taking a psychedelic when you're dysregulated, you are going to trip. It's going to be bad. And then setting is like, do you feel safe in the environment? So don't go to like a cabin by yourself when you're super anxious and take some shrooms. That's a terrible idea. But a guided journey can go really well.
Wow. How do you feel about um hypnosis therapy?
I don't know a lot about it.
I have an experience
Um,
with it, so I just want to get your opinion of it.
I feel like it probably could work because it's creating neuroplasticity, so it's changing your mind.
Mm-hmm.
My hesitation about it is that for people who've been through trauma, a lot of their wound is control. They didn't have control over what was being done
Mm.
to them. And so when you do a therapy that also takes their sense of control away, you sometimes lose that agential or like that sense of
Mm-hmm.
agency over the new paradigm. So if you're changing their brain in a way that they weren't really aware of
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't have a sense of control over it, you're sometimes recreating the trauma. It's another reason why I'm not a huge fan of prolonged exposure is because you're telling them like, I'm going to expose you to the thing that you're most afraid of,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to do it in this way. And there's this like mechanistic sequence. There's this like way that it's done, and they don't have a lot of control over it. I mean, they do, of course. They can say
Yeah.
no and decide when they go to the next step. There
Mm-hmm.
is a sense of control. But in some of the other therapies that I'm certified in, there's so much control. Like in accelerated resolution therapy, we use these like beautiful creative metaphors to add new imagery to the existing memory. And they get to decide what those are. So I'll say like put a poster of something that feels really stuck, like a sensation that's stuck from the old memory.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're going to color it over with paint. Okay, and now we're going to erase it. Okay, put up a new poster of something that you want to look at. And then
Mm.
they put up a new poster. That new poster is now associated with that past memory.
Yeah.
They created all of that.
And that's what
So
happened with
the
me
more
with hypnosis. Is exactly what you just said, except I don't think it would work for everybody. Like I felt in control the whole time, but that's just because
cool.
I'm me. You know, like somebody else might not feel in control and it wouldn't work. So I totally get what you're saying.
I think
Yeah, and
what's
I probably don't know enough about it to offer like a good solid opinion.
Yeah.
So definitely take a grain of salt.
I'll send you a link because I think you might be interested.
Yeah, thank you.
what's so interesting to me about this conversation about control is I don't know that you hear that conversation a lot in relation to trauma. And there are people that like feel like going into like a therapy setting would be very an
Do you
unsafe
know anybody like that, Rena?
space. Yeah, I don't know anybody. Sometimes we ask things
A
because they,
friend.
yeah. But it's
Sometimes we
really,
become trauma therapists to figure our own brains out.
yeah.
Totally.
So I have a book that I love on CPTSD that it is like just so I think it's Pete Walker, I think is but is
Yeah.
just so eye-opening, because it talks about not feeling safe in a therapy setting. But now what I'm hearing you say is there are these different techniques that don't tell you something is wrong with you, you need to fix yourself, like, and it seems like there are things that are much more accessible because they don't ask you to just completely relinquish control or put yourself in a space that feels very unsafe.
And the other thing that I tend to not do, and I don't think it's super trauma informed, is you should not be expected to tell your story of trauma. Everything that we now understand about brain pathways is that the more that you go into those traumatic memories, the more that you strengthen them. So when I talked about single path that you're going down, you're remembering that a lot, whether it's conscious or like subconscious, you're reactivating your responses to it. So the opposite of that is to not get stuck in it. So um, until I do a processing session, which is a very deliberate session, we don't talk about trauma. We talk about the trauma's effects on your current functioning, your current thoughts, your current behaviors. We say, why does it make sense? And so we allude to it, but we'd never go into the details. So another thing that I see a lot of clinicians do that I'm always advising is just don't ask them, especially in the first session, don't ask them to do their ACE score or tell them about the most traumatic events because they're going to start associating you with that trauma. Now you're a part of that memory. And you're never going to create that sense of co-regulation and safety again, which when they do the research on therapy, almost all therapy works just as well as anything else. So when they like studied 10 things against each other, they're all pretty similar. The main factor that decides if a therapy is going to work is whether you trust your therapist. Be working really hard towards that.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, and a lot of people complain when they've tried to get therapists. They'll be like, "Oh, I tried it, but it just these people, I didn't trust this one. This person was crazy. This person didn't know what they were doing. I was smarter than this one." Keep trying. Keep trying. Because there's one out there, like a lid for every pot kind of thing. Because it took me a long time to find one.
Yeah, I guess
In my book, I have an entire chapter on how to find a therapist.
Oh, nice.
Because it's one of the
fantastic.
Yeah, chapter 28 in the Modern Trauma Toolkit.
Oh, fantastic.
One of the most common questions I would get on TikTok is like, how do I find a therapist that's safe for me? And especially if you're like a Black woman in America, like you probably need to explore Black female therapists, because your lived experience is something that is causing you trauma on a daily. And for somebody to have a greater understanding of that. Or you might choose to have somebody who doesn't have any of those experiences because you might not want to bond over that. So being really deliberate about the kinds of things that are important to you. Is it important that your therapist is not conservative? Like I actually have seen therapists that were conservative and we still were able to work together. So like knowing what that looks like and what kinds of questions you can ask during that early interview, because the first time you see somebody, you're trying to decide if it's a good fit. It's not that you're sitting in the chair without power. So go in there with your full agency intact and say, this is what I'm looking for. Do you think this is a place we can get to together?
Yeah, the job interview, really. Yeah.
Totally.
I never even thought about the first session being that, but you're totally right. You should be interviewing the therapist. Oh my.
This has been very eye-opening.
Yeah, that's so smart.
I have lots of childhood trauma that I won't go, but it's fascinating to me to think about, like, because therapy is just something that has not been ever accessible because of the trauma is also intertwined with therapy and therapists. And so it's like immediately a triggering unsafe space. And I've tried to, like, because I do content writing and stuff, I've tried to suggest, hey, can we get some of this in here? I can't be the only person with this experience, right? Like, can we help give people, like, what do you do? Where is a safe space? Like I have to think that there are lots of people that have had similar experiences. And I just desperately want, because I'm looking myself too, to like, you want to give people those tools, that safe space. And so I love this, that so much of it is in your toolkit. Can you, in addition to finding the therapists, are there other things that, like, for people that just are so averse, that you can call out, that might, for people that might want to get the book that are listening?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the Modern Trauma Toolkit with that in mind. Not just that people can't see a therapist because it's triggering, but also people can't see a therapist because they're working too hard. They don't have any health benefits. They literally can't afford it. Like the kinds of therapies I'm talking about, they're often $200, $250 an hour. So if you don't have a benefit plan that covers the kind of therapy you want to find, let's be honest, a lot of CBT is out there, and some CBT therapists are trauma informed, absolutely. And CBT can work for some people. But in my experience, there's a big backlash of people saying, why are you trying to gaslight me, saying that my thinking is wrong? My thinking is like that because of what I've been through. And that is just such a validating perspective. So there's a lot of branches of CBT. Like some people get put into DBT programs, which is group therapy, and they learn lots of different skills. Huge fan of skill learning. It's also very structured, and like it's a routine with how those classes go. And sometimes that structure is hard for folks. I love acceptance and commitment therapy, which is another branch of CBT. And it's basically saying, it makes sense that you're stuck in these ways. And what would it look like to accept the things that have already happened and the ways that you have dysregulated reactions and move towards new ways of showing up that are more aligned with your values and goals? So I like that because it's a bit more of an open and sweet question. But to me, NARM, or neuroaffective relational model, I think will become a dominant uh, therapeutic tool for lots of folks who deal with developmental trauma. It is so beautiful. When I started learning it, um, like I just felt so much lighter. It was such a safe way of approaching therapy. There's so much agency involved. Um, like your sense of you being able to heal your child parts, which is very internal family systems language, but NARM does it in a slightly different way. It's kind of letting you know that you have everything you need to get to where you want to go already and just showing you that the path is already there, which is amazing. So internal family systems is another one that lots of people love. I mean, all of this comes from early therapies when we would imagine that the parts of us that were stuck in trauma responses are still inside and that the adult consciousness needs to go in and soothe them. So there's lots of different branches that have this perspective, and they're gaining a lot of traction because it's nice to be able to think, well, I can soothe myself. Like I'm the one that I need right now. It's not my therapist, it's not my mom, it's me.
Mhm.
I can do this. That's an amazing feeling.
Yeah, I'd like to try to attempt to boil this down to something more simple because, um, for instance, everything you've said has fascinated me, every single point. But because there were so many points, I wouldn't, even though I have a therapist, but if I didn't, I don't feel like I would know where to start. I feel like getting your book is definitely where I would start. But so that I know that the book is right for me, what would it by reading the book, what would it make me feel like? Would I see too many options, or would I see like I love the part about the section on how to find a therapist. Like how would that come about? Like how is it laid out so that it's not overwhelming?
It does have a lot of concepts in it for sure. My
Hmm.
goal was for everyone who reads the book to come away with their own toolkit. So, what does it look like to learn how to soothe my own nervous system? You can learn that by reading a book. You don't have to see a therapist to soothe your nervous system. So, I tried to
Hmm.
put enough in
Okay.
there where people would say, "Oh, I've got new skills that I can now use in my day-to-day life."
Okay.
Um, I also have a lot of background about what is trauma so that people can start to see themselves through that lens because a lot of people don't identify with that word. But more and more people are. So if you've experienced racism or sexism, that's probably traumatic. It's probably changed how you
Hmm.
view yourself and view the world. That's trauma. That's the change that is trauma. So the tagline on the cover is nurturing your post-traumatic growth with personalized solutions. So what I'm doing is I'm planting seeds of flexibility, new ways of being and
Mm.
thinking, seeds of hope that things can be different because so many people think, well, this is just who I am, especially once you've been diagnosed with a personality disorder. Oh my gosh, we need to throw those out. They're so freaking harmful.
Mm.
You don't have a disordered personality, you probably have a response to complex trauma,
Mm.
my personal opinion. Um, then you feel like this is just who I am. Is it though? And is it the way you want to be? Okay, well, let's see what else is available to you. So planting hope, and then mostly foundational to trauma recovery is self-compassion. So my language is super compassionate, like really gentle and nurturing and safe. That was
Hmm.
my goal, was to write a book that was really safe. So
Mm.
Pete Walker's book, for
Nice.
example, it's helped tons of my patients, but he talks a lot about his own trauma. So
Hmm.
some of my patients got really triggered reading that.
Mm.
My goal was to write something that was less likely to send you down those pathways.
Mm.
Yeah, I loved his book, and yeah, I had a proud moment. I wrote an article, and then and I sent it to him, and he said,
Oh,
"Good
amazing.
job." And yeah, I was doing some writing on like what they call now the mother wound and like mother trauma uh
Yeah.
because I have that lived experience, and because it's so stigmatized like that, and so often like I will talk about it not because I want to rehash my trauma, but because you just want to erase that stigma and give people. I'm a big believer that you just need the space to say like this was my lived experience. I don't need to rehash everything, but it's okay for me to not have a relationship with this person or like things like that. Like this is okay. Like this is my choice. It was healthy and safe for me, and I just want there to be space for people to say that. And which is why I sometimes will write and talk about it.
Well, and that's coming from a place of self-compassion and compassion for others to say, I want you to feel seen. I want your experience to feel validated. I went through this too. Um, One thing that I think is really important is when we have this mother wound, which so many people do, and we don't talk about it. Um, when we work on ourselves, we often can heal that ancestral lineage, both literally in our genetic codes, our
Mm.
DNA, but also when we figure out those stuck patterns, because it probably didn't start with her either. So
Mhm.
these
Mm-hmm.
things get passed down generationally. Boomers are not the way they are because of choice. They're the way they are because their parents were also probably not very giving of loving kindness and affirmations and unconditional regard. The more that we can learn to be different, the more that we heal these wounds for generations, which is what the world needs right now.
Mhm.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I find it really encouraging though to hear a lot of like younger parents just talk like, and you see it online all the time, just really trying to be mindful and trying to heal from that. And I have conversations with peers a lot of like unpacking things and going, okay, like I'm gonna be very conscious of the way I act towards my child because I'm not gonna do that. And I feel like that's very new and it's a really beautiful thing. And I hope we continue because my theory is we'll have a better world if the climate doesn't take us out, you know, before then. But
So
Um,
I'm giving a TED talk in a couple of months in Oshawa, Ontario, and the premise is that our non-response to the climate emergency is collective dissociation. It's the things
mhm.
that we deny that are happening. Like the pandemic is still happening, but
oh,
nobody
yeah.
wants to talk
Oh,
about
I
Yes.
know.
it.
It's
It was
over.
really
Yeah.
It's over.
Yeah.
I know.
yeah,
It's
everyone
ridiculous.
wants to believe it's over and don't even talk about measles or bird flu or anything else
Yeah.
because these scary. And
Yeah.
so we want to believe it's happening. And I get that. Like it makes sense that you'd want to disconnect from these things that are real and scary and frightening. But the more of us that can stay regulated and face our reality, the better chance we have of tackling these big problems.
Yeah. So that was going to be my question to you is like, how do we get more? Because you need many people to tackle these issues. And I think the really unfortunate part is there are very like the billionaire class, and there are very greedy people that just don't are not scared in the way that the people who are disassociating from it, they just are like, well, I'm gonna get mine and that's it. I'm not concerned, I guess.
I have a theory that they're actually dissociating too, because I
Mm,
mean,
mm,
who wants their grandkid to grow up in like an inferno, right? So like they care about their own kids and their grandkids, presumably,
mm,
but they're still disconnecting from the reality that they're creating for them. So
mm,
I actually do think a lot of those people who are making decisions are dissociated. Um, I mean, Gabor Mate did a whole thing about like Trump and his childhood, and I don't want to presume that I know anything about it, but from what I've heard, there was a lot of like sadness and disconnection and
mhm.
feeling less than and abandonment. It might make sense that he wants to be the next Messiah, and platform himself in these ways where he's looked up um, to a really dangerous level. So a lot of the things that we're seeing in this billionaire class are actually healing some childhood wounds. I firmly believe that. I
So
do not
then,
believe Putin had childhood.
so
No.
then, which all that all makes complete sense. So then it's like, where does that leave us, right? What do we what do we do? How do we collectively get out of these really dangerous circumstances with climate, with people just ignoring all, all of these new diseases that not just this pandemic, but we're probably going to see more in the future. So it's like, how do we
Yeah.
respond to it in a way that actually helps our species survive?
I honestly think that the first thing that we do is to figure out our own stuff. So every individual who learns how to stay in what Dan Siegel, he's a psychiatrist, he calls the window of tolerance, which means you can handle things. So many of us can't handle these big problems, and we just get so afraid we end up in fight or flight about it, or we're even more afraid and then we're in freeze. So the more that we learn that we can handle hard things, the more of us will start to tackle it. So I used to think the climate emergency was this massive problem, and how could I, as like a family doctor, get involved? Well, now that I'm more regulated, I'm on my city of Calgary's climate advocacy or climate advisory committee. I am a member of Physicians for the Environment. I'm doing a TED talk linking climate to trauma. I'm trying
Oh,
to
when
do
does
this
that
like
come out?
uh it'll be in it'll happen live on June 8th. So they usually take a couple weeks to get to come out live. But my topic is how to feel safe when the world is on fire.
Mhm.
So that question you're asking is what I want to address in this talk.
Wow.
So it's just outside of Toronto in Oshawa on June 8th.
Hmm. What are some what are some common traumas that people may have experienced but may not have be recognizing them as traumas? Because I feel like there's a group of people out there who are just like, you just get over it. These people are just being weak and stuff, but they might not know that they actually that thing that happened when you were a kid or the way things were when you were a kid, that might have been trauma. Is there anything to that?
Um, Yeah, one thing I'll share is the way that, so I've mentioned the neuroaffective relational model a couple of times as being one of my favorite cognitive therapies. The way they look at childhood wounding, I think, is so beautiful and universal. So they talk about this desire for connection and this fear of connection. So the connection wound can happen very early on, and it leaves the people like constantly searching for connection. Well, if I just do this, then people will like me. But they also fear it. Don't you dare get too close. If you cross this boundary, I'm out of here.
Mm,
So a person who shows up with a connection wound, that might be how they show up in relationships, like love bombing and then distanced.
mm,
So they have that connection issue. Same goes with trust. I want to be able to trust, but I have a huge fear of trust. So if someone says to me, I really feel like I need therapy, but I'm super scared of therapists, in my brain, I'm like, oh, yeah, that might be a trust issue. Somebody
mm,
along the line betrayed your trust. And one of the most important healing factors is to tiptoe. I call this moving at the speed of trust and just really checking in and saying, how are you feeling? How's your comfort level? And sometimes I'll take like 6 sessions to jump into trauma processing, and sometimes I take 6 months. We move at the speed of
Mm.
trust if there's a
right.
trust wound.
What is an
Um,
example of trust issues that you might have as a child that that would be that someone might not know? Oh, that's a trust issue. Like a parent that always said, "Go outside," because my generation loves to go. My parents used to say, "Just go outside." I don't know. Is that something where it feels to a kid, my parent doesn't care about me, even though you're not thinking of it with your conscious mind, or like, is there something like that?
yeah, it depends on the kids. So I kind of said earlier that you can
Mm,
have 3 kids who grow up in the same household
right.
and one of them will have experienced complex trauma from that
Mm-hmm.
house. It kind of has to do with all of your other experiences, your genetic makeup, and the story that you tell yourself. So if the story that you tell yourself is, my parent didn't
Mm.
care about me and they don't care about getting my needs met, that's a huge betrayal. And then you will have trust problems. And weirdly, it's actually safer for a kid to believe my parent chose not to meet my needs than for us to believe my parent can't meet my needs.
That makes
So we
sense.
often blame ourselves like, well, there's something wrong with me. My parent chose not to meet my needs because I suck.
Mm,
And then we end up having this like shame wound thinking like, I don't deserve to get my needs met
mm,
when that was the story that we told ourselves as a kid. And in actuality, our parent wasn't capable of meeting our needs, which was too scary for us as kids to
mm,
contemplate. We don't go there. We blame ourselves. So sometimes the trust wound will show up like, well, you betrayed me. You didn't meet my needs. So I suck. And
mm,
then you have really low self-esteem. And every time you're in a relationship, you don't even bother to say what your needs are because you know they're not going to be met.
mm. Wow. Yeah, that's so true. Wow. Yeah. I call it the biological milkshake you're born with. Um, and then things happen to you. And whatever you were born with helps you either cope or not be able to cope with all the external environmental things that happen to you. And that's why different people react differently to different things. Plus, there's a million other things that can go on too, from your air quality to your everywhere you live, the elevation of where you live. There's a million things. Nothing is just simple. That's why you have to figure out yourself, and it's a long process, and you should love yourself enough to do it. That's all I got to say about
Yeah.
that.
Oh,
If
thank
geez, if you have time to do it, right? Like if you're
Yes.
not so
Oh,
busy,
that's
like
what I
just
was gonna
trying to
say.
survive,
When you
right?
were saying earlier about that, I was like, it's capitalism. Capitalism works
Mhm.
on fear. Like the best way to have to sell your product is if people want it. And so the rich and the corporations are doing it. They're promoting fear so that they can sell you their product or their service. So it's kind of a cycle. Well, yeah.
Along those lines, I have a
you. Sorry, go ahead.
I've got a related question for you. We're seeing the rise of online therapy and
Mm,
all of these online therapy platforms and like, oh, these are more affordable, they're more accessible. And then the companies have data leaks and, and things like that. And so I'm curious, what is your perspective on those? Like, say somebody's looking at them, because I'm sure like all of these articles have links to them and they're heavily
Yeah.
promoted, right? Like, so
Yeah.
what is your take on those?
I'm a little nervous to give like a blanket take, but I mean, a lot of these therapists are getting paid like $30, $40 an hour. A lot of them are still in training. They might not have a
Mhm.
lot of training because if you could make $200 an hour in private practice, why are you choosing to make $40 an hour online?
mm.
So I'm a little curious about that. Like,
Be
why is
careful.
it so cheap? Be
Mhm.
careful because sometimes you get what you pay for. But also, like recognizing that there's time-based privilege and financial-based privilege, that this might be the only
Hmm.
thing that's accessible to you. And in which case, the step one of trauma healing is noticing how your nervous system feels when you're with that therapist. Do you feel safe? Can you regulate? Are you learning skills? Does it feel like you are increasing the shame wound or not? And the more that you notice the processes that are happening inside, you're going to know if it's a fit that's helping or not. I mean, some people are so dissociated that they're not very good at noticing their own internal environments, and then the therapist should be good enough to like say, hey, this is the first thing we've got to do is actually learn how to feel your feelings. Learn how to recognize when your nervous system is in fight or flight or freeze collapse. So again, even though you're on an online therapy, you should be able to screen your therapist and just find
Hmm.
out like, are they trauma informed? Have they done some training in trauma? Not all of them have. And some, as it sounds like you've experienced, can make it worse. Um, One of my good friends, Kate Truitt, she's one of the teachers for the Havening techniques. She's a psychologist and a, you know, neuro anatomy researcher. So she just gets the basic biology of a lot of this stuff. And her second book just came out yesterday. It's called Keep Breathing. And one of the amazing things that I love about it is she talked about how she had to learn this to overcome her trauma. So her as a practitioner, she started to study this because of her childhood. And then her fiance died basically in front of her days before the wedding. And
Oh God.
so she was trying to figure out, I know, right?
Oh,
I mean, for me, I survived the earthquakes in Nepal in 2015, and I had some pretty significant PTSD symptoms. So a
yeah.
lot of us are trying to figure our own stuff out. And because we have this biology background, we're like, okay, wait a minute, there's actually a way to do this.
Hmm.
So, she'll say flat out, like, her first therapist harmed her. And I've really learned to trust my instinct when it comes to the kinds of therapy that I do, including psychedelic. I know when I'm safe and when I'm not. And I've just learned to trust myself because that took time, but I can do it now.
Hmm.
That's great advice because that's something that anybody that's looking for a therapist, and even if you can only access these online, at least try to access how you're feeling. I think that's great advice, and try to do some vetting to the extent that you can by looking up the person and their background and the types of therapies that they practice. But yeah, it sounds like just really trying to think about how am I feeling during this experience, which I don't. And again, I encounter so much content all the time about health and advice, and I don't know that I see that a lot. So I think I'm going to include that to the extent that I'm working on that type of content of like, hey, listen to yourself. Here are some questions to ask yourself. How are you feeling? How are you able to regulate?
With the corollary that when you're a kid and you're going through trauma, you actually can't escape your environment for the most part.
Hmm.
So one of the things that kids learn to get really good at is ignoring the signals of danger.
Hmm.
So one of the things that you have to reintroduce is a relationship to those signals.
Yeah.
And that in really baby ways. Like when I work with folks in the early stages of trauma therapy, we'll work on emotions like frustration or irritability before we get to things like anger or sadness, because that can unlock some really big stuff.
Hmm.
And these are people whose inner child has learned to suppress these big emotions because it didn't help them to express it and they couldn't have escaped it anyway. So it's a bit of a corollary is that if you've had significant childhood trauma, sometimes that instinct needs to be relearned and reconnected.
Hmm.
Some of the practices in the modern trauma toolkit are helping people figure that out. Just relearning what your own signals are.
So I guess to that end, then for people that have that experience, are there like maybe credentials or types of therapies or things that maybe if they can't get that gut reaction, can they look for, oh, this person is trauma informed or certified in this? That is there anything uh,
Yeah,
that might be
there
helpful?
are trauma-based certifications. So like there's a CCTP credential that I've got and many other folks have. Um, I think just flat out asking, what kinds of things do you do for trauma and what's been your experience and how successful has it been? Have you got special training in trauma? It would be a great question. Um, my personal perspective is to ask if they have any training in body-based traumas because it's not a common thing to have. And that would generally trigger a thought in my brain that they probably have a better understanding of trauma because they know that working on the nervous system and sometimes not talking about the trauma to start is a really nice doorway to approach. So many of the best trauma therapists that I know, so Simone, she's on TikTok as the Cognitive Corner. She turned out to live in Calgary, but I met her on TikTok. She also does a lot of somatic trauma therapy. Um, the ennui therapist, like so many people that I've met on TikTok who I think of as the experts in trauma, they have in their toolkit both top down and bottom up therapeutic options. So that would be a question I would think might be important. But it's not going to be true for everybody. Some people, even the word body is triggering, and then they're not going to want to do somatic stuff at all.
Just so you know, we're on the 20-minute mark. So anybody that hasn't come up with something they've been dying to say, because we tend to chat a lot about a subject because we get excited. So make sure we get those out. If there's anything I don't know that you've been wanting to say that we haven't covered.
No, you guys are amazing at this. I love your questions, and
Oh wow,
it's so off
thanks.
the cuff. So many people will like read the questions that my publicist will give, and
I looked
you
at them,
really,
but
yeah, you're speaking more like as humans. I like those interviews too, don't get me wrong, but
oh yeah.
so much more natural to just vibe.
Yeah, like you're fascinating, and every time you say this much stuff, I have so many topics in there, and it's hard to remember which question I want to ask and which thing I want to. So yeah, it's like it's very stimulating, to say the least.
I have a really wackadoodle brain. I
Good.
think like I'm a great kid and I was bullied really heavily for it when I was younger.
Mm,
Um,
me
because
too.
I was also like I didn't really know how to handle my own brain. So I just wanted to share everything that my brain was thinking all the time, which wasn't super helpful.
I
But
wish I could shake
look at
your
me.
hand, and so we could. We have jackets. I'm in the same club as you. Exactly the same. It's funny.
Which is awesome. You've got this podcast and you can share. And this is why I love sharing because I'm like, I love learning. It's my
Mm.
favorite thing. I will never stop. So I just finished my doctorate and I signed up to get certified in lifestyle medicine, which is like sleep, exercise, nutrition, stress reduction, like
Oh,
all of
wow.
these things that are just so basic that all
Hmm.
doctors should know. But oh, now it's like a whole branch of medicine.
Hmm.
Crazy.
Yeah. And I
So
do
yeah,
mattress
I love learning
testing.
and sharing.
I do like you're right, the sleep that's kind of branched off to all of these different things and there's nothing, it doesn't seem like anybody has the sum of all of these different parts. And so now there's like because of the art, like, and I know a lot of it just because I know the content that's being produced. And so I know like there's like I mattress test now. That's the thing. Because the all of the
That's
sleep
not a
content
euphemism.
is
It really does.
yeah, like so because all of the sleep content is so and I'm like, but if you can't get sleep, it's probably related to the trauma, like it all like nobody's kind
Huh.
of tying. I mean, not always, but some people have sleep apnea and things like that,
Mm,
but
yeah.
yeah, I've got to talk to you again. I love it that you're amassing all of these different
Yeah.
all of this education in all these areas because
Yeah, we could do
I
so many
don't,
topics with
yeah, like
that.
I don't think people are pulling it all together. And that's kind of what I'm looking for. Like instead of going over here and it's like, let's talk about trauma over here, let's talk about sleep over here, let's talk about this condition, that condition over there. Like let's talk about the sum
Yeah.
of all parts. And I'm very fascinated in like treating people as the individual, like both in like regular body medicine and then also in in therapy because it's
Well, and I think that's why my work is so unique because not only do I have this understanding of trauma, I also worked as a family doctor for,
Mm.
I'm
yes
still, I
that
still,
yeah
so I do have an understanding about sleep and nutrition and, other ways of reducing stress outside of trauma therapy. So I did incorporate a lot of that. And then because I love learning, I'm also trained in Ayurvedic medicine. So I was a
wow
huge yoga
What's that?
practitioner for
Oh.
like 20. So it's basically where yoga comes from is the Vedic texts that are like 10,000-year old written in Sanskrit.
Wow.
And so Ayurvedic medicine is one branch of it would be yoga
Hmm.
and asana. But other branches are things like pranayama, which is breathing techniques.
Mm.
Um, they have a whole thing around nutrition. One of the things that I found just so amazing when I started studying polyvagal theory, which is the branches of our vagus nerve, was Ayurvedic medicine has been talking about this for 10,000 years and they call it the gunas. So in the gunas, we have sattvic tendency, which is when you're super calm and you're in your window of coping. So in polyvagal theory, they call that your vagus nerve that feeds the face. And then you can also have rajasic, which is restless energy, or tamas, which is heavy, solid, thick, still energy. Well, one of those is fight and flight, and one of those is freeze. So we have ancient knowledge that goes back tens of thousands of years that is coming around in modern times where we can now explain it from like a physiology perspective. But like, what can we learn from Ayurvedic practice? So my book also includes breathing techniques from Ayurvedic medicine. I think that we've ignored ancestral knowledge to our peril and saying like only Western medicine is the best. Well, yeah, like if I need a surgery, I'm definitely going to go see a surgeon. Or if I have like an infection, or I fully believe in vaccinations. Like these are important Western skills that keep our mortality the way it is right now. But there's also a ton of stuff that we've ignored and has been in our bones. So I love learning that stuff too. I became a Qigong group teacher. So there's Qigong, which is like a branch of Tai Chi. It's the healing branch of Tai Chi. There's a really amazing teacher in Minnesota who does something called Spring Forest Qigong. So when you say you're bringing all of this stuff together, that was literally my purpose, was to learn all of the things so that nobody else had to learn all of the things. And that's what my whole life mission is to like just learn as much as I can, break it down in a really simple way, and share it with as many people as will listen.
You're also, I have to say, like again, having talked to so many different mental health and physical health, all different. I probably have interviewed hundreds of clinicians at this point, and very few of them I can usually remember them are so good at distilling things down to a level that it can really help somebody that has no baseline knowledge, and you are exceptionally good in that area.
I think it's my background in health equity. Like I've always worked in communities where there's been low health literacy, low language literacy, and my thing is like I'm not the smartest doctor in the room. I'm one of the most curious, which I think helps. But what I'm good at is something called KT, or knowledge translation. I can take a complex topic and break it down in a way that most people can understand. So that is my special sauce. That's why I blew up on TikTok. And that's why I wanted to put the book out in a way that was the most accessible book about trauma out there. That was kind of the tagline to the publishers. Like anyone can read this. It's super easy. There's these really big concepts that everyone should know. Like if you're a parent, you should know this. If you work with the public, you should know this. This should be common knowledge. I don't know why we don't teach it in schools. Hopefully that's one of the changes we could make.
100%. We need to teach a lot of things in schools. Empathy would be a good one too.
Oh, right.
Yeah, for sure.
And self-compassion. Like kids are so themselves. Like I see this on TikTok too, is they're constantly comparing themselves to like the fake life that's online.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, that's so cool. I'm just afraid to start a topic because if I do, it'll go too
this
far.
time just flew by.
I flew by. I was like,
both of us are just so jazzed to be talking to you.
Yeah. Like, hope we didn't overwhelm you with the barrage of our brains.
Hopefully, you know, my dinner is like cashews.
That's cool. Because like one of the things you said a little while ago about ancient knowledge, I was trying to it sparked something in my head about I feel like one of the reasons why it's good to look back into ancient knowledge is because like nowadays everybody's really distracted by a ton of stuff. Not that it wasn't distracting back then, I'm sure, but no, your recreational time or your times to think, you probably really were more internal with your with how you thought of things. So maybe you were able to develop methods like different methods to coping with trauma and stuff. Whereas today, if you're upset, you might watch a Netflix, you might stream, you know what I mean? Like, and I feel like back then, like, the lights go out, it's time to think, and I mean, really, I mean, there's fire, but and this made me think that it's a really good time. It's a really good thing to look back at those times because they probably have some really great knowledge that they learned through just chatting and brainstorming with each other. Oh, does that help you? Oh, that helps you? Oh, that's great. So that helped me a lot to look into that more because I've been kind of,
Yeah.
negative towards it, but I think I understand it better now.
Yeah, I because I was trained in Western medicine, I also had closed some of those doors too. But the more that I started to explore, like yoga, for example, like I started doing yoga in like 1999. So I'd been doing it for so long and I knew how much it helped me, but I didn't really understand that there was this whole medical curriculum behind it. And this
Mm.
was just one small facet of
Mhm.
Ayurvedic medicine. And the more that I got curious and said, well, okay, well, what else did they know? Or like, why, when we do like a Brahmari breath, like bee breathing in yoga, why does it relax me?
Mm.
Turns out there's a really good anatomical explanation for that. So I can say both, like, I'll tell my patients to do humming, like bee breathing, as a way to regulate. But I can also explain to them why it works. So I I love that balance of like the Western knowledge about I can tell you about your vagus nerve, but also, hey, let's try this thing that humans have been doing in India for 10,000 years.
Mhm.
Um, and let's learn from all of these other backgrounds and environments because Western medicine does not have all the answers. We got some miserable people here.
Yeah. Rena, do you have anything you wanted to say before I give her the last question?
Well, I mean, I could go on for
I
hours,
know.
but we probably we're
That just means she's going to come back.
Yeah. I I do want to put you in my Rolodex though of experts to interview it because you have such a wide breadth of knowledge. So you
I
might
love
hear,
sharing.
yeah, you might hear from me in the future on an article. But yeah, I mean, this has just been so fantastic, and I've really enjoyed exploring all of these different topics, your knowledge on the topic. But yeah, Jason, I am afraid to dive into something
I
else because
know. Well, that I'm seriously though, I do think that would be great. I love when at the end I feel like we got to ask her back sometime for sure because there's so many things that. But this last question is completely off topic. It's a great way to just decompress right after all that. It's a hypothetical and it's kind of fantastic. Um, it's basically picture yourself where you are right now, which is very easy. And through the door, someone runs in the room. They look exactly like you do right now, same clothes, except they seem stressed, disheveled, maybe a little tear in the clothes. And she runs up to you and she says, "Come with me right now. I'm from the future." What do you do? I love that look.
I have the DeLorean. Um,
Marty!
uh, yeah, obviously.
I need
Um,
fuel. All right.
so it's so funny you asked that question because I have been writing forever, like poetry and short stories. And I started collecting stories from my grandma about our Ukrainian ancestors coming to Canada.
Mm,
So I started to write a book that was like historical fiction about everything they'd been through. And oh my God, that was crazy. Like you could not make stories up that are more wild about what my family went through immigrating to the wide open prairies in Canada 120 years ago. So my grandma told me all of those stories, and I tried to sell that book, but I also had a modern day protagonist, and she was going
mm,
through like some similar stuff, but it wasn't quite as scary. So I was like, okay, let's put her 30 years into the future. And so then I created
mm,
a book that was like historical fiction and cli-fi. So I've actually been thinking really hard, like, what does a generative future look like? Like, what is a future where some things where the tipping points have already passed have happened?
mhm,
Like, there will be food scarcity. We've already locked that
mhm,
in. Well, what does it look like in best case scenario that we've actually figured this out? So I had to try to think of like, well, what do I want the future to look like? So I've been spending tons of time thinking about a generative future because
mm.
even though I believe that there's all kinds of shit going down that we've passed their tipping points for, I still have tons of hope for us
You
as a
have to.
planet and a species. And honestly, if not, there's just fun in figuring it out anyway. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think of this whole thing as way more playful, probably because of the psychedelics I've done. And I just really like being playful about it. So I'm going to try as hard as I can to turn the train around from jumping off a cliff. And even if we do end up with half the train falling off the cliff, I'm going to still try to be playful with it. I'm looking forward to whatever the future looks like, disheveled or not.
Hmm.
Bring it on.
Nice. We're all warriors in this battle.
But wait, so then does that mean you go?
With the
Oh
person? Yeah,
yeah. I mean,
I
I'm a bit of a risk taker. Like, I've been to 70 different countries. Like, I am
Wow.
more than willing to throw myself into
wow.
the unknown. I love
Nice.
it.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
awesome. All right, that's great. Well, we have everything in the description, and this is the live version, but we'll also be editing it, so that'll come out a little bit later. But is there anything you want to plug? I hate the word, but what's the word? Promote? Like your TikTok channel for
Um,
sure. You
yeah,
book
TikTok trauma. Um,
TikTok trauma.
The book is on sale on Amazon. I have no idea why. So the book is supposed to be 19.99,
Mm-hmm.
and for months now it's 14.99.
Mm-hmm.
So it is super, super cheap. It's paperback. Most people read it in a weekend. Like, it's a really easy read. So read it, buy it for your friends. Like,
Yeah.
this is something that everyone needs right now, is to figure out their toxic stress responses. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm just really trying to get it in people's hands. My goal with my publisher was to make even the price accessible.
Hmm. Excellent. That's
Oh,
great.
and I read the audiobook, and I do not
Oh,
talk
you
this
did?
fast on the because they told me how to read an audiobook, and it's really slow. So,
Ah.
if you like my voice and can imagine it's slower than what it's been for the last 2 hours, the audiobook is really gentle.
Hmm.
I tried to make it very melodic, prosodic, so like a lot of nurturing
Mm-hmm.
sounding. So if you feel like reading a book is going to be too much because your thinking brain is offline, grab the
I'll
audiobook.
definitely be listening to your voice. I promise that because I'm just not a reader, but audiobook.
People aren't. Yeah. And it was like the funnest experience ever.
Oh,
So
that's
yeah,
great.
reading your own book,
Nice.
amazing. So yeah, hopefully your listeners will have stimulated their curiosity and hope and self-compassion, and they will
Nice.
go down this path too.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you.
Oh yeah, anybody listening, please like share for sure, especially with this topic. And subscribe and comment. Let us know what you think about what was said here. Yeah. Thank you again very, very much. It was wonderful.
Oh, thank you guys. It was a brilliant, like, even for me, the 2 hours sped by, and I had a crazy busy day. So this was really enjoyable.
That's
And
awesome.
just let me know how I can continue the conversation.